Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a totally fascinating intersection of media, politics, and the law. We're going to start with this explosive clash between late-night host Jimmy Kimmel and the Trump family, and then we'll zoom out to examine the actual data-backed science behind political satire. It's a pretty wild ride, taking us from a single controversial joke all the way to a deep dive into how our minds actually process political humor. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit 1, the expectant widow joke, 2, the Trump's demand action, 3, Kimmel defends his comedy, 4, comedy's political impact, and finally, 5, ethics and free speech. Basically, we're going to impartially unpack the timeline of this specific controversy and then analyze a Cal Poly academic study on how late-night comedy really influences public opinion. All right, part 1, the expectant widow joke, a controversial punchline, sets the stage. Let's get right into the specific events that sparked this whole national debate. Okay, let's break down this timeline because the timing here is absolutely crucial to understanding the conflict. So on April 23rd, Jimmy Kimmel taped a mock version of the White House Correspondents' Dinner for his show, but then 2 days later, on April 25th, a very real, very terrifying incident actually happened. An armed individual attempted to enter the real Correspondents' Dinner ballroom. Just a couple days after that, on the morning of April 27th, both Melania and Donald Trump publicly demanded Kimmel be fired for his taped remarks. By that very night, Kimmel responded on air. So what were those remarks exactly? Well, during that mock roast segment, Kimmel delivered this specific line. "Mrs. Trump, you have a glow like an expectant widow." He delivered this while pretending to host the dinner as part of a larger comedic monologue that targeted the former president and first lady. And this single sentence, it's literally what set off the entire conflict we're exploring today. Moving on to part 2, the Trump's demand action. The White House responds. Following the traumatic events at the real dinner, the Trump family's response was swift and fierce. Listen closely to the precise language used here. Melania Trump issued a statement on social media calling the joke hateful and violent rhetoric. She argued that, this isn't comedy at all. It's atrocious behavior that just spreads hate right into American homes. She explicitly urged ABC to take a stand against the late-night host, saying his words deepen a political sickness in the country. And shortly after, Donald Trump backed up his wife's sentiment on Truth Social. He characterized Kimmel's monologue as a despicable call to violence, directly referencing that armed man who had just tried to enter the actual Correspondents' Dinner. He definitely didn't mince words, demanding that Disney and ABC terminate Kimmel immediately. Which brings us to part 3. Kimmel defends his comedy. A comedian relies on the First Amendment. Let's take a look at how Kimmel addressed these massive, high-profile demands for his termination. So Kimmel gets on his broadcast, addresses the audience, and basically claims his words were taken entirely out of context. He stated the punchline was just an obvious, harmless comment on the couple's age difference. Plus, he reminded everyone that the joke was recorded 3 whole days before the frightening incident at the real dinner, meaning it was absolutely impossible for it to be a literal call to violence. He also pointed out his own long-standing public advocacy against gun violence and made sure to say he was genuinely sorry that the people in that ballroom had to go through such a scary event. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the core of our explainer today. We've got 2 starkly different interpretations of the exact same broadcast. On one side, you have the argument that late-night comedy has become dangerously corrosive, crossing the line into inciting real-world political violence. And on the flip side, the assertion that this is obvious parody, strictly protected as free speech under the First Amendment. But this whole intense clash forces us to pause, right? We gotta ask a much larger, evidence-based question. If we look beyond the outrage and the defenses, does late-night humor actually change opinions? Like, does it sway voters in the real world? Or is it just harmless background noise? Let's get into part 4, comedy's political impact, analyzing the data behind the laughs. To answer our question, we're going to pivot away from the headlines and look at a comprehensive academic study out of Cal Poly that measures how late-night humor influences viewers' political awareness. So the study actually categorizes shows like Kimmel's or The Daily Show as quote-unquote fake news. Now, keep in mind, in this specific academic context, fake news doesn't mean malicious disinformation. It specifically refers to news parody and political satire. The researchers point out that this format uses comedy to completely deconstruct political media spectacles. It often acts as a gateway, getting people super interested in actual news. But crucially, and we're going to come back to this, it is not held to strict journalistic moral codes. Let's look at the actual numbers here because they are pretty wild.
Researchers showed participants short, funny video clips of 2008 presidential candidates Barack Obama and John McCain making self-deprecating jokes. On a 9-point scale, before watching the clips, Obama's likability was at 4.9. After, it jumped all the way to 6.4. McCain's likability saw a similar bump, going from 3.6 to 4.7. Now, McCain's compassion score did dip just a tiny fraction of a point, but the overarching trend is super clear. Humor significantly increases a politician's likability scores in the eyes of the public. And, this data proves exactly why politicians have historically used late-night comedy as a highly calculated strategy. Candidates deliberately appear on these shows to get their message out and sell a likable, relatable image to voters. Humor works as an incredibly effective tool for learning and retention. Basically, people just remember things a whole lot better when they laugh. All right, final section, Part 5, Ethics and Free Speech. The legal and moral boundaries of satire. This proven power to actually shape public perception brings us right back to the ethical dilemma at the very heart of the Kimmel-Trump feud. First up, let's look at the law. Legally speaking, the Supreme Court has ruled that the First Amendment protects satire and parody, period. And this protection explicitly applies even if the joke causes severe emotional distress to a public figure, which Kimmel's joke arguably did to the Trumps, given the scary context of what happened at the actual dinner. And because comedians operate under the banner of entertainment, they just aren't legally required to follow the strict ethical codes of fairness and objectivity that traditional journalists have to abide by. But here is where it gets really complicated. The Cal Poly study warns of a growing modern dilemma. Late-night shows are increasingly focusing almost entirely on politics. And because of that, massive segments of the audience are now using them as their primary news source. Comedians are evolving from just being entertainers into actual political activists. They hold immense sway over modern democracy, influencing campaign awareness, campaign finance debates, and real-world voter perceptions. The data clearly shows these aren't just jokes anymore. They're incredibly impactful tools that actively reshape political reality. Now, the law says comedians can say pretty much whatever they want, but just because something is legal doesn't automatically mean it's ethically sound when you're broadcasting it to millions of people. Which leaves us with this final thought for you to chew on. When late-night satire has the proven scientific power to change real opinions and shape an already polarized nation, where do we draw the ethical line? Should comedians who function as news sources be held to a higher standard, or is the freedom to offend the very foundation of our free speech? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.